I've had a lot of questions over the years about how it came about that I ended up with this cabin. And there's a video on here that shows in pictures, in music, the history of the cabin, but I want to relate the verbal story. It started one day, winter day in 1984, and we had a farmhouse out in more civilized country about 30 miles from here. But I was out here wandering around one day in the forest, got an old trail, and that led to another trail, and I came walking up on a clearing, and this cabin sat here. Now, it didn't look like much. In fact, this is what it looked like. As I walked up and looked into the cabin, it was so spooky inside and so dark and nasty that I didn't even want to walk in. I was afraid to, really. I didn't know what might be lurking in those dark shadows inside this place. Well, over the next months, we did some research and searching around. I started asking around, trying to find out who owned the cabin. And nobody really seemed to know, and someone said, well, we think that's on state land. We think there was a trade for it. So I'd finally given up trying to figure it out. And the next year, on a sled, we pulled an old stove in here and we walked inside and kind of got it cleaned up enough. And we spent one night here at the cabin. And this is what it looked like then. Well, the next summer I got a phone call from a friend, and he had found out through someone else, a forester, the name of the man who owned the cabin. It ended up that it was private property. Well, I was getting ready to go to work at the auto factory, but I took a few minutes and we did a search and I found the man's phone number and I called him up. And I mentioned that we'd found his cabin, that we really liked it back there, and we were just curious about it if he'd want to sell. Well, he started describing it to me, and I was trying to catch all the words, but I heard cabin and I heard 40 acres, and he said $2,000. Well, I was a little bit awestruck by that. That was a very cheap price, and I didn't say anything. And he described it a little bit more, and then I guess he thought I was bargaining with him, because then he said, well, how about $1,200? Well, I finally was able to get some words out and assured him that that was a very cheap price, and that if he was willing to part with it, we would sure like to have it, because we really like spending time back here. Well, with that deal struck, I then had to figure out how to get it done, and so I told him I'd call him right back. And I called an attorney up in this area, and he explained to me how we could do it the fastest and easiest way. So we set up a transfer of paperwork and money, and basically, before I headed to work that day, I'd purchased the cabin. Within a few years, on our trip home one winter, we stopped by their place down in southern Minnesota, and we had supper with him. And I had many questions about the cabin and its history, and he knew quite a bit. He knew that a man named Felix Innes had owned the cabin, and then in 1951, Jack had bought it with the intention of logging it off, and Jack had just got married, so he and his new bride came back, and they spent their honeymoon year living back here, and he explained they had potatoes and honey, and the meat was running by the front door. And he hauled firewood to town and sold it to make a living. After he had logged it off, they didn't have much use for it, and they moved closer to town, and he wanted to sell it. So he put an ad in a farming magazine. Farmers from southern Minnesota saw the ad and knew they'd like to have something like that. So they responded, and it was set up to come up and see it in January. Well, Everett laughed about that in hindsight when Jack had him come up in January to look at it for a deer camp. You see, because there's not a lot of deer in this area most of the year, but around Christmas time, the deer migrate in here, and they are thick in January and February. So he knew when to bring prospective clients in to look at the land. Well, they come up and obviously were enthralled by the deer running everywhere and trails everywhere and the deer hunting aspect. So they purchased it in 1952, and the group of them spent a lot of wonderful years up here as their deer camp. They were known enough in the area that in fact the other hunters in the area, they called this the farmer's camp. With so many such arrangements as age and health concerns took more and more out of that hunting group, by 1978 I think the last visit had been made here. When I found it in 1984, it was looking pretty shabby. Just little plastic in the windows, trees had fallen across the roof. Porcupines had moved in and made a real mess in here with their droppings all over the floor. During that visit with Everett, I asked him about water, because the only thing I ever saw here was there was a stovepipe buried in the ground out here about 7 feet deep, and then there was a coffee pot tied to a stick, and you could dip down in that hole through that stovepipe and you could bring up some water. So I asked him what they did for water, and he said, "Isn't the pipe still there?" Well, then he had a chuckle because he knew that they had a monument just outside the door of a huge mountain of beer cans that they just pitched them onto their trophy pile when they got done with them, and over the years that pile had gotten mighty big. Well, he knew that, and so with a twinkle in his eye, he just kind of looked at me and he said, "Of course, we didn't drink much water." Then in the later years, we had the cabin. Some of the sons of those original farmers group, they would come up here just for old time's sake, because they'd been here as children and they'd crawl around this cabin. And back right over here, this was, if you look at the way this old picture, you can see the way the bunks were. Now that'd be the obvious place for children to get out of the way and get up on top of those bunks, as the older people were over here at the other end of the cabin with a table. And while they're up there, they were carving their initials in this top beam up here. And I've been very careful not to sand those away as I clean up the cabin. And those little kids, as they come back as grown men, they got a kick out of seeing their initials carved in there so many decades ago. I'm so thankful that Everett saw it in his heart to part with this piece of property. I think he knew that his times up here were long past, and like me, he wanted to see it go on into the being used some more by others who would enjoy it as much as he had. But again, with one of those twinkles in his eye, he looked across the table at me at one point and said, "I thought I was stuck with her till you come along."